Tendor Dorjee is an activist and writer and the former executive director of Students for Free Tibet, a global network of students and activists dedicated to advancing Tibetan freedom and human rights. His writings have been published in various forums, including the Huffington Post, Global Post, Courier International, Tibetan Review, Tibet Times, and the CNN blog. He is a regular commentator on Tibet-related issues on Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, and Voice of Tibet. Born and raised in India, he holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a master's from Columbia University. He worked at the National Endowment for Democracy before working at Students for Free Tibet, where he served as executive director from 2009 to 2013. He is currently program director at Tibet Action Institute. Tendor is a recipient of the 2014 ICNC Research Monograph Award. And with that, I will now pass the audio over to Tendor, and he will begin his presentation.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone at ICNC for this opportunity. And so here I will start my slideshow. Hopefully you all can see my slides now. So basically, I will try to, instead of putting out a summary of my monograph, which is actually really long, what I will do is try to focus on two particular central questions that drive this monograph. And the first one is related to an experience I had when I went to India. I think it was in 2011 or 2012. I was at a meeting of Tibet support groups. So this was an international conference that happens every 3 years, and we were there in Dharamsala, India to so there were a number of support groups and Tibetan NGOs trying to discuss plans, campaigns, strategies for the Tibet movement. And I remember during a plenary session, somebody asked a question to the effect of what kinds of campaigns or activities, nonviolent campaigns or activities, can be organized or can be carried out inside Tibet, can Tibetans inside engage in? And the answer given by one of the very high senior officials in the Tibetan government in exile was, well, nothing is possible inside Tibet. The repression in Tibet is too great. It's so great that no kind of nonviolent resistance is even possible in Tibet. So this was one of the questions I wanted to answer or explore, at least, in this monograph. And the second question is related to the 2008 Uprising, probably one of the most significant events that have taken place in Tibet in recent memory. And here you can see one of the most widely circulated images from the 2008 Uprising in Tibet. And in fact, this image of a Tibetan man holding a knife and another person holding a chain is actually one of the most widely circulated. If you type 2008 Tibetan Uprising, those words in Google, basically this image will come up on the first page. And it was seen by a number of people, and basically it was one of the images that prompted several observers to raise the sensationalist question: are Tibetans turning to violence and extremism? Are Tibetans tired of nonviolence? And these are some of the headlines that influential media put out in 2008. So you can see here from the Christian Science Monitor, Young Tibetans Question the Path of Nonviolence. You can see from BBC, Exiles Question Dalai Lama's Nonviolence, and then there's this headline from New York Times. So basically, in brief, what my monograph on the Tibetan nonviolent struggle tries to do is focus on two particular questions. The first question being, is nonviolent resistance effective or even possible inside Tibet, where repression is one of the worst in the world? The second question being, are Tibetans turning to extremism and violence? So in order to look at these two questions and try to answer them. One thing that I've tried to do in the monograph is to focus on the 3 Tibetan uprisings and the evolution of Tibetan resistance through these 3 uprisings. And while the flow of the resistance and the story of Tibetan resistance is not limited to the 3 uprisings. In fact, there's a number of things, important things that happen in between the uprisings. But basically, in terms of broad strokes, if we try to summarize the story of Tibetan nonviolent resistance, then the 3 obvious places to look at are the 3 uprisings to some extent. And so the first uprising was in 1959, more conventionally, although the full length of the uprising probably went from 1956 to 59. And the second uprising in 1987 to 89, although some of the most frequent incidents of protests actually took place in 1992 and 93. So I try to look at this whole period of the second uprising starting from 87, not just ending in 89, but going as far as 1993. And the third uprising of 2008, but the actual uprising period going beyond 2008 and lasting for a couple of years after 2008. So I try to do a quick analysis of these 3 uprisings and looking briefly at each of the uprisings. The first uprising was actually not a non-violent uprising. It was largely an armed uprising. The Chinese government invaded Tibet in 1949, 1950, and basically starting from 1956 and peaking in 1959, there were a number of incidents of Tibetan rebellion against Chinese invasion, Chinese occupation. And if we look at the nonviolent tactics used in the first uprising, there were only about 18 out of the 198 documented tactics compiled by Gene Sharps. Basically, you know, in the strategic nonviolent field, the standard kind of text for nonviolent tactics and the, you know, the documented nonviolent tactics that movements all over the world have used for as long as we have studied nonviolence. I think Gene Sharp was the kind of the pioneering theorist of nonviolent strategy who put together this list of 198 tactics, and he has tried to, he's basically classified these tactics into 3 categories. The first category being protest and persuasion, and the second category being non-cooperation, and the third category being nonviolent direct intervention. So under these categories, Tibetans in the first uprising used only 18 out of 198 different nonviolent tactics. There were, of course, marches, some of the obvious ones, street protests, and one of the tactics that Tibetans used in the first uprising was, you know, the formation of a parallel institutions. And now with the second uprising starting in 1987, the number of nonviolent tactics that Tibetans used rose dramatically. And this is a photo of the 1987 uprising, the first major incident of Tibetan protest in the kind of modern, that launched the modern Tibetan resistance. This person is Champa Tenzin, who became an icon of the Tibetan nonviolent resistance. So this photo was taken in Lhasa. And by the time of the second uprising, by 1987, much has changed in the Tibetan resistance in the sense that the last remaining bastion of armed resistance, which was the Tibetan guerrilla movement based out of Mustang in Nepal, that base had been shut down by this time. That base basically closed down in 1974. And so the guerrilla base from Nepal, operating from Nepal, was kind of like a remnant of the armed Tibetan uprising led by the Khampa guerrillas, the Khampa warriors. And that base operated from Nepal until 1974. But since then, since 1974, there has been no organized armed resistance in the Tibet movement. So the Tibetan movement, since that period, became officially and almost basically completely nonviolent. And in the 1987 protests, actually, Tibetans began to use a much more diverse range of nonviolent tactics. And during this period, the most popular form of resistance, the most popular tactic was still the street demonstrations and the marches, but Tibetans began to kind of explore other avenues of tactics as well during this period. And they began also using creative art, such as, graffiti, and one of the most popular new kind of tactic during this period was the poster campaigns. Tibetans putting up posters in all these alleyways in Lhasa, and these poster campaigns became kind of a back and forth kind of debate between the Tibetans and the Chinese, because sometimes the Chinese police will try to put up posters condemning the Dalai Lama and blaming the West for the Tibetan movement, and then Tibetans would take the opportunity to respond to those posters by putting up their own response posters with answers clarifying why the Tibetan resistance is a nonviolent struggle led by Tibetans. So this was during the second uprising. And the third uprising took place in 2008. And unlike the first, which was largely violent or largely armed uprising, and unlike the second, which was confined mostly to Lhasa, the third uprising was not only non-violent, but it spread to all three historical provinces of Tibet. There were scores of incidents of protests during this period, and the range of non-violent tactics that the Tibetans used during the third uprising increased quite dramatically. And here we will look at a visual representation of how the non-violent tactics increased from the first uprising to the third. So what we can see here is going by, so we'll try to look at each of the three categories. The first category on the left, you can see protest and persuasion tactics. So these tactics include everything from protest marches, demonstrations, vigils, petitions, letter writing campaigns, poster campaigns, graffitis. All of these go under these category, this protest and persuasion category. And the second category, non-cooperation, that includes economic boycott, social boycott, institutional boycott. So all of those kinds of activities go here. And the third one is nonviolent intervention. That includes basically going to the source of injustice, and these tactics include things like blockades, for example. Standing in the middle of the road in order to blockade or stop a truck or a convoy of trucks that are trying to go to a mining site. So trying to stop injustice at the source by intervening, that kind of actions go under nonviolent direct intervention. So when we look at protest and persuasion, we can see in the first uprising period from 56 to 59, Tibetans used 11 of those tactics. In the second uprising in 1987 onward, Tibetans used 24 of those tactics, and in the third, 30 of those tactics. And we can see a similar rise in the non-cooperation section as well. So altogether, combining all three of those categories, what we can see is in the first uprising, Tibetans used 18 tactics out of 198. In the second, 41 tactics. And the third uprising in 2008 onward, almost 60 tactics. 60 out of 198 tactics were used by Tibetans in the nonviolent resistance. So this is hold on a second, let me. Okay, so here is a closer look at the protest and persuasion tactics. All the tactics that have been used, I've just basically checked it, so we can see, and I'll make this available so people can look at this later as well. And here are all the non-cooperation tactics that have been used in the first, second, and third uprising, and we can see the numbers continue to increase toward the third uprising. And here are the nonviolent intervention tactics, including nonviolent obstruction, nonviolent occupation, alternative social institutions, alternative markets. So all of these. And here's a summary, basically. So basically, based on this really brief visualization of the tactics and this brief summary, what becomes really obvious is that Tibetan struggle has become increasingly nonviolent over all these years, and increasingly, a tighter move toward a tighter embrace of nonviolent resistance. And for anyone out there who wanted to make the argument that the Tibetan struggle is actually becoming more violent or more extremist, they would need to come up with some really strong evidence to back up their claims, because when we look at these numbers, they show the reality very clearly. So this answers one of our questions that I posed in the beginning, and this also partly answers the second question, which is nonviolent resistance actually possible to carry out in Tibet? If it weren't possible, then we wouldn't have all these tactics increasing to, from 18 and 41 to 60. So I think that partly answers the second question. But the question that I'm more interested in looking at now is nonviolent resistance effective in Tibet? And that's something that a number of people, especially a number of Tibetans and Tibetan leaders, try to ask in with some measure of despair and hopelessness. So Tibet is one of the most oppressed places on the planet, even quantitatively. Freedom House, this human rights monitoring group, which gives scores to every single country, every single territory on the planet, based on the amount of civil liberties and political rights people enjoy. So Tibet, on that score, have every year got 7 out of 7 score for civil liberties as well as political rights, and that's actually one of the areas where you don't want a high score. Actually, a high score is the worst thing you can get. So in a place like Tibet, where Freedom House has designated is one of the most oppressed places on the planet, and where we know Chinese repression and brutality is some of the most extreme that we have seen, how are nonviolent activism and resistance really, can they be effective? And here, so I'll briefly try to look at 3 examples, or 3 kind of really brief case studies. And so this is 2008, following the Tibetan Uprising, the crackdown that followed was really extreme and heavy-handed. And basically, the Chinese government ensured that there was no space for political resistance in terms of street protests, demonstrations, public displays of discontent, or public displays of grievances, public displays of devotion to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So basically, China locked down all of the public spaces inside Tibet, including all the streets, all the monasteries, with surveillance cameras and checkpoints everywhere. So, however, so here's all the monasteries being locked down and monastery compounds being taken over by militarization. But this clampdown did not stop Tibetans from taking action. In fact, it had this unpredictable result or impact. The resistance, which was kind of chased out of the streets, basically moved indoors, and Tibetans started taking more dispersed actions and started to use more of the non-cooperation tactics rather than protest tactics, for example. And here was one example from Nangchen in eastern Tibet, the Nangchen vegetable boycott. So this was 2011, and okay, so I have seven or 8 minutes now, so I'll try to be quick. So Nangchen vegetable boycott was 2011. Basically, in this town, much like in many other parts of Tibet, the Tibetans have a huge disadvantage when it comes to opening businesses, because the Chinese entrepreneurs or the Chinese business people, the Chinese settlers who come to Tibet, they have a huge advantage in terms of language, in terms of access, in terms of connection, and so all the vegetable grocery stores, the green groceries in Nangchen, were owned by Chinese, and they were slapping these astronomical price tags on the vegetables, and the Tibetans were having a hard time being able to buy the vegetables. So some of the Tibetan sort of local community leaders or organizers, they came together and they said, let's do a boycott of these vegetables, these Chinese stores, vegetable stores. And basically, everyone agreed, and within a month, this boycott became so successful that the thing with vegetables is it's not like computers. If you don't sell a computer today, you can sell it like 6 months down the road. But with the vegetables, if you cannot sell like potatoes in the next few days, they're gone. They're not worth anything. Same with bananas, green vegetables. So when Tibetans refused to buy vegetables from these Chinese stores, a number of these stores had to close down. They had no business, and within a month or a little bit over a month, some of the more entrepreneurial Tibetans went over to the nearest kind of big market and brought vegetables back, and they set up their own like pop-up shops in Nangchen and started selling vegetables at much cheaper prices. So the result of that boycott was many of the Chinese stores had to close down, and new Tibetan shops opened up and selling vegetables. And we've been hearing that this campaign was so successful that nearby towns, nearby Tibetan villages were also trying to emulate their example. Another example is the 2009 incident of a standoff at a Tibetan mining site where a Chinese company was carrying out mining operations. And Markham was this place in eastern Tibet, and the local villagers of Markham basically came together because the result of the mining operations on their mountain, which was called Sirnullo, a sacred mountain that Tibetans worship basically in that area. The result of that operation was such that it was poisoning the entire environment of that region, and it was poisoning or polluting the rivers and the local water sources. And the Tibetans, whose livelihood was mostly nomadic in that area, their cattle, their yaks, and other kinds of cattle, they were really suffering in the sense that the yaks were losing their hooves, their teeth were falling apart, and animals just began to die like flies, and people weren't sure whether they could drink the water or not. So the situation was really severe, and Tibetans in that region had no recourse left except to resist. And first they tried to petition the local authorities and didn't get any response. Later they tried protesting and didn't get a good response to that. But eventually in 2009, I think it was in summer of 2009, they came together and they organized a blockade of the only one road that led to the mining site. And the Chinese company, its convoys of trucks that had to go to the mining site, without that road, there was no other way to get to the site. So these about 500 Tibetans came together and they made a communal pledge or a collective pledge to say that we are going to sit down here together and nobody is going to leave. Everybody basically made a pledge to say, I'm going to sit here until we win, or basically until like the end of, even if it costs us our life, I'm still going to sit down here and not leave, basically. So this was the tactic that they decided to use, and it led to a standoff because the Chinese authorities ended up in a quandary about this. They didn't know what to do, because usually one of the popular tactics that the government likes to use is they would fire at the crowd, and the result of that would be it would disperse, or it would scatter the crowd, because people would be scared, and if they shot at one person, everybody else would run away. But this time, because of the communal pledge, which is kind of a traditional practice in some of the Tibetan villages, people consider that pledge really sacred and important, and nobody is going to break that pledge. So the Chinese authorities knew that if they shoot, they would have to shoot every single person. So they would have a massacre on their hands. So either the option was that, or they would have to figure out something else. And after a standoff that lasted for about 15 days, eventually we heard the news that the Chinese authorities had decided that the mining company would move away from that area, and the mining operations on that mountain in 2009 was halted. So this was another kind of concrete, although small, but concrete and important kind of strategic victory for the Tibetans at a local level, kind of organizing and resistance. And finally, the third example that I wanted to give is, I think, something that many Tibetans and many of the supporters and observers of the issue are now aware of, called the Lakar movement, or a campaign that kind of emerged after 2008. It was a campaign that basically said, let's try to create a different kind of parallel space for resistance. And this space was basically a space in people's daily actions, daily lives. Let's try to change our individual behavior, our individual kind of use of language, for example. So one of the facts about Chinese colonization of Tibet is that over the last 50 years, the Tibetan language has been completely marginalized, and a number of Tibetans who grew up under occupation, while speaking, Chinese basically has penetrated and become a big part of the Tibetan communication. And people exchange phone numbers in Chinese. Like basically it comes up everywhere, in all conversations. And many of the younger Tibetans also used to actually kind of speak Chinese rather than Tibetan. But after 2008, the Lakar movement emerged, and it was started by a few, small group of Tibetans in eastern Tibet, and then spread to Lhasa and other places. And the focus of that movement was, to take really small actions, small acts of resistance was the kind of slogan, basically. So let us speak in Tibetan, let us eat Tibetan food, let's wear Tibetan clothes. And this was really like, it was a really simple kind of way of resisting, and I think some would call like existence as a form of resistance kind of idea. And they decided to do this on Wednesday because the idea of committing to do something all the time is really frightening and intimidating. But if somebody said, let's do this thing on a Wednesday. On Wednesdays, let's commit to speaking in pure Tibetan. Let's commit to buying from Tibetan restaurants or businesses only. It sounds much more doable. And people chose Wednesday because Wednesday is a significant day in the Tibetan kind of social calendar, because it happens to be the Lhasa of His Holiness. Lhasa meaning kind of auspicious day in the week for His Holiness. So people have always kind of considered Wednesday an important day for religious offerings and religious activities, but now the significance of Wednesday became more part of the resistance discourse, because people wanted to do something that would contribute to the resistance, and it would be an individual act of resistance. So then slowly, once people started to do it on Wednesdays, they were like, okay, it's actually not that hard to do. We can do it on Thursday. We can do it on Friday. So it became much more sustainable. It became much more widespread. And since 2008 until now, this movement called the Lakar campaign, it slowly began to create a new culture of Tibetans taking pride in speaking Tibetan, Tibetans taking pride in kind of resisting China's cultural influences or linguistic influences. And it's had a huge impact on the Tibetan mentality or the Tibetan mindset of, where before people used to think, okay, resistance is simply not possible. But now people are like, okay, there's actually all this private space where the Chinese government still cannot penetrate, and we are going to take over this space and use it as a wedge to pry open other kinds of space for resistance, other kinds of space for advancement of our movement. So this has created, in the end, a very much more sustainable kind of resistance on the Tibetan plateau. A number of people engaging in this, and not only in Tibet, but also in exile as well. Except in this presentation, I haven't really focused on the exile movement so much because I'm trying to focus mostly inside Tibet. So this brings me to the conclusion, which is that I think, from these three stories, as well as the some of the really rough data of protest tactics and everything, and like resistance tactics we looked at earlier, we come to basically the answer that Tibetan resistance has become increasingly nonviolent over all these years, over 60 years, and also the fact that nonviolent resistance, and especially strategic and creative nonviolent resistance, is not only possible in Tibet, but it is also effective, even in spite of the fact that Tibet remains one of the most repressed countries on earth. So that's my conclusion. And just one really quick story I want to share here is here's a photograph of Egypt, the uprising in Egypt. And actually in 2000, and I think it was in 2009, I went to the FSI, the Fletcher Summer Institute, training on nonviolent resistance that was organized by ICNC. And I met a friend, a new friend from Egypt, and he was an activist from Egypt who, during the workshops, he kept saying, okay, nothing is possible in Egypt, So all the new ideas that were coming out during the training, he kept saying, oh, that's not possible, this is not possible, because Egypt is really the most oppressed place in the world. And during a break, I went over to him and talked to him. And as soon as he realized I was from Tibet, he said, oh, you know what, Tibet and Egypt, we are both the same, because these are the two worst places on earth, and no resistance, no nonviolent resistance, none of the actions are possible in those two countries. And I think that's a sentiment shared by a number of people, both in Tibet, in the Tibet movement, both in other movements as well. And I think oppressed people who are part of all these different movements for freedom often have this kind of sentiment that in our region and in our struggle we face the greatest oppression. But the reality was that a couple of years later, the Egyptian movement toppled Mubarak, and they still have so far to go. They still have so much work to do before getting to a good place. But the fact was, yeah, they were able to defeat Mubarak just a year after somebody had, told me that it was completely impossible. And I think this was a story that continues to kind of inspire me, because I got to see what is possible when people organize together with good strategy and good, planning and good coordination. So I just wanted to share that one piece about this. So thank you so much for following this presentation. I really appreciate all of you for your, attention. And I just, once again want to thank ICNC and everyone, Mache, Hardy, and Amber, and David, for all your help in making this possible.
All right, thank you, Tendor. So now we will leave some time open for questions. At the bottom of your GoToWebinar application, there is a space to ask questions, or you can use the yellow raise hand tool if you would like to ask a question using audio. So let's just get this. Okay, all right. So it looks like, Tendor, we have a question. Do you consider self-immolation as a strategy or tactic for the nonviolent struggle? How successful are self-immolations in Tibet?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So the question of self-immolation is something that I have, addressed just a little bit in the monograph, but not at length because it's a very important and huge kind of topic that was kind of, impossible to address without dedicating like 20 or 30 more pages to this monograph, which was already, pushing 100 pages. But I think, yeah, the self-immolation has been one of the biggest kind of trends and biggest events to take place in recent memory following the 2008 uprising, and it has just transformed the Tibetan movement, and it has transformed not only the movement, it has transformed the Tibetan discourse. It has transformed in a way what it means to be Tibetan, and so it's like there's a few different ways of approaching this question, and one question is, yeah, what you just asked about whether the self-immolation is a tactic or a strategy. Another question is whether self-immolation is non-violent or not, and there has been tons of debate on this question, and I would say self-immolation is not, to me, it is not a strategy. The way I see self-immolation is a tactic. It is a non-violent tactic in the sense that it is basically, in that fine line. If you look at all the entire spectrum of non-violent resistance, it is in that fine kind of border area, because it constitutes the act of, putting harm to your own body, basically burning your own body. And it from a visual perspective, it is very shocking to anybody who sees it, and it is disturbing in some ways as well to people who see it. But I think the best analysis of what self-immolation means has been written by the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a letter to Martin Luther King when the Vietnamese monks were self-immolating to protest the oppression by the Vietnamese government, but the U.S.-supported Vietnamese government, the regime against Buddhists. And Thich Nhat Hanh basically argued in his letter to Martin Luther King, trying to explain why the Vietnamese monks are self-immolating in that period. That this was basically the monks saying, what I'm trying to say is really important. This is the most important message that I have to the world. And in order to make the world listen to this message, I'm sacrificing my own body as an offering, or as a way of making this impact. And in terms of effectiveness and impact, I think the Vietnamese self-immolation, the series of self-immolations took place in Vietnam, had a huge impact on the political situation inside Vietnam. And when we compare this to the Tibetan self-immolations, people often say now more than 140 some Tibetans, almost 150 Tibetans have self-immolated in the last 4 or 5 years. And the first Tibetan to self-immolate was Thupten Ngodrup in 1998 in Delhi. But basically, this many number of Tibetans have self-immolated, and when people try to look at the impact, I think it is really hard to measure. It is still too early to see or say whether the self-immolations have had an impact or not. But what we can definitely see is, from a Tibetan movement mindset, just the way Tibetans think about what it means to be Tibetan. Every single Tibetan, if they were not really interested in the movement before, individual Tibetans who were actually in Tibet doing quite well from a financial perspective, and who were kind of, not really for the Chinese occupation of Tibet, but who did not really mind living under occupation so much, because they were the handful of Tibetans who were benefiting from the occupation. Even those people, if you talk to them today, they have been completely transformed and changed by this phenomenon of the Tibetan self-immolations. And I think that in itself is an impact on Tibetan history that cannot be denied, that cannot be rejected. And in a way, it is the greatest impact that any action has had on Tibetan struggle. And that's why I think, in terms of impact, regardless of, there are of course other impacts, as in what the self-immolations have done to global support for Tibet, how it has kind of reactivated many people's attention to Tibet, as well as among the Chinese. In 2008, during the protests, many Chinese were able to write on the internet and condemn the Tibetan protesters, saying that they have been brainwashed by the Dalai Lama, they've been brainwashed by the United States or the CIA, they've been brainwashed by the Tibetan exiles. But when somebody in Tibet set their bodies on fire, the Chinese government says they've been brainwashed. But it is really difficult for ordinary Chinese to buy that argument. And I think one of the ways of recognizing that evidence is in the silence of the Chinese public, or the Chinese ordinary public, about self-immolations. Because in 2008, the Chinese public was not silent. They were busy condemning the Tibetans. They were writing the most horrendous accusations against Tibetans. But today, after these self-immolations, the Chinese media, the Chinese public, the Chinese blogosphere, the Chinese social media is kind of silent. And I see this silence as a sign of Chinese public and the Chinese kind of, the cutting edge of the Chinese society, more progressive people, reconsidering everything they've been told by their own government. So that's how I see it. And in terms of tactic, I think, yeah, self-immolation is definitely, I would say, a highly expensive and highly costly non-violent tactic. And I would say every single Tibetan, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, want to see the self-immolation stop. And every single Tibetan and our supporters want for a situation where no single Tibetan would have to go to that extent or go to that length to have to sacrifice their own life in order to make a contribution to the cause. And I see, the movement, campaigns such as Lagar movement and other kind of transformative movements taking place inside today as a part of an alternative narrative or an alternative history that Tibetans are trying to write, that run parallel to the self-immolations, but it is a growing narrative and a growing kind of path that is becoming more sustainable and increasingly life-affirming, to the sense that it will hopefully attract more people to join this kind of resistance.
All right, great, thank you. We have another question. Somebody asks, what can the Tibetan diaspora do to help those non-violently struggling inside Tibet?
I think there was a number of things. There are a number of things that Tibetans in diaspora, whether they're based in India or Nepal or Europe or US or Australia, anywhere, can do to help the Tibetan struggle inside Tibet. And I think to a large extent, to some extent, Tibetans in exile have been taking doing everything they can in order to help the struggle inside Tibet, whether it is through, helping with communication, for example. I think one of the major factors that can make a difference for people inside Tibet is the degree of communication people have across Himalayan communication, and in recent years, I think this kind of communication between exiles and Tibetans in Tibet have become much more robust, thanks to advance in technological and digital tools, and I think the act of staying in touch with folks inside Tibet, with families inside Tibet, with friends inside Tibet, I think that single-handedly actually makes a huge difference to help people inside Tibet in terms of having their information come out to the global media, while at the same time helping to provide global news, world news from independent sources back to the Tibetans inside Tibet. Because what China wants is for Tibetans in Tibet to live under this kind of information black hole where everything has been cut off, and the Tibetans get their news and information only from Chinese government sources. But I think Tibetan exiles have played a pretty big role in helping Tibetans inside to actually reach and access these new and alternative sources of media and information. And Tibetans in Tibet are today actually, given the circumstances, they are quite remarkably well informed about global affairs and what's going on in the rest of the world. So that's one way. I know that another way of helping Tibetans inside Tibet could be actually with tactical, strategic resources. And one of the concrete ways of helping could be actually to monitor the situation in Tibet, so that the activists, taking care of the Tibetan activists inside Tibet, because they pay a much higher price for everything they do. And when somebody ends up in jail or in prison in Tibet, the Tibetans in diaspora have an incredibly important role to play. And when organizations or Tibetan individuals outside or our supporters, and when we pressure foreign governments to mention the names of these political prisoners, it makes a huge difference to individual political prisoners inside Tibet. And sometimes I feel that we forget how much of an impact this has on the ground inside Tibet, because so many people tend to look at the issue in a black and white frame, so that people often like to say, oh, everything we do is not going to, we haven't been able to free Tibet, so everything we do has failed. But that's a really destructive and unhelpful way of looking at the situation. We should be able to look at the situation, and measure, nuanced progress on the ground, nuanced progress in the movement, looking at number of Tibetans who are active, number of Tibetans who are online today. And I think, in the life of a political prisoner, for example, right now there are more than 2,000 Tibetans who are political prisoners in Tibet. In this summer, in July, one of the most high-profile political prisoners died in prison. And these are, situations that are ongoing. And one example that always stands up to me is the example of Paulin Gyatso, Tibetan political prisoner who spent 33 years behind bars for taking part in political nonviolent protest. And when he came out, he said that he noticed, because he has this really incredible memory of his experience in prison. He always used to be curious about why on certain days and certain months his treatment in prison became much better than usual. And then he just, when he was in prison, he couldn't figure out why his treatment was going up and down, and the prison guards were sometimes really brutal with him, sometimes softer on him. And only after he escaped to exile sometime in the 90s did he realize that his treatment in prison actually completely matched up with the international campaigns that were waged on his behalf. Every time there was an Amnesty International or Tibetan NGOs leading some kind of a petition campaign on his behalf, every time a political leader out here in the free world raised his name, somehow during those days his treatment in prison was much better. It gave him much more breathing room in that sense. So I think this is true for all the other political prisoners in Tibet, because they are the ones who are at the forefront of the resistance, who are at ground zero of resistance, and they're paying the highest price. And if we out here can, continue to redouble, increase our efforts on their behalf, and even naming names have this kind of impact on their lives in prison, that or at least, if nothing else, we can create more breathing room for them so that they can survive. And if they have survival, that is victory in some sense. And that kind of survival they use to, fight for their own dignity. But without survival, they cannot fight for dignity. And what we on the outside can provide is helping them to survive. But there is still much more than that Tibetan diaspora can do for the struggle inside Tibet, and I've tried to lay out some of the additional details from a strategic perspective in the monograph toward the end.
All right, thank you. So also in your monograph, somebody who's read it has asked, you talk about transformative resistance in your monograph. Can you tell us more about what this means and its significance to the Tibetan struggle?
One of the ways in which the Tibetan resistance has changed over recent years is the direction of the resistance, and also the angle and the orientation of the resistance. And especially for people inside Tibet, up until 2008 uprising, the framework of the resistance was very much focused on Tibetans versus Chinese, us against them. And every single uprising, the natural frame of the debate, or the frame of the discourse and the resistance and the struggle, is always Tibetans versus Chinese. And that can actually be a very disempowering kind of framework, because if you look at the balance of power between Tibet and China, people immediately go to the narrative that, okay, Tibetans, how can we ever take on China, because Tibetans are only 6 million, and Chinese population is more than 1 billion. And then if you look at the economy, Tibetan economy is not even worth mentioning next to Chinese economy of, second largest economy in the world. Then you look at the political powers, then you look at military powers, all the nuclear warheads China has, Tibetans have none. So people like to look at these kinds of comparisons, which can be really disempowering. And for Tibetans, oh, what can we ever do that will effectively challenge the Chinese government's power? So this is really a monolithic kind of way of looking at the imbalance of power between Tibet and China. But recently, over the last few years, I think Tibetans have tried to focus in a different direction, toward themselves, kind of inward-looking kind of resistance, inward-looking activities, constructive programs and actions where, whether we win or not, or our power is actually not dependent on the Chinese government or what they do or how much power they have. In fact, it is kind of like locating a source of power that is within yourself. So for Tibetans, especially through the Thakar movement, the resistance became about strengthening Tibetan power, strengthening Tibetan culture, the resilience of the culture, and improving the quality of our own education, and tactics and initiatives such as holding classes in these monastery backyards with voluntary teachers, and all the students, they really diverse student groups, from the youngest 5, 6, 7-year-old kids to some of 70-year-old grandmothers, them going to classes to learn how to write Tibetan. So this kind of focus shifting toward Tibetan culture and language and the inner source of kind of strength and resistance, tapping into one's own mind, speech, action, it has some kind of Buddhist or religious overtones, but at the same time, I would say rather than religious, it is more a spiritual kind of overtones. Tibet being a very spiritual kind of culture and nation, it became really appropriate or suitable in the sense to tap into the heritage of Tibetan culture. And once that began to take place, that's where the Tibetan resistance and the way Tibetans look at their own resistance and conceptualize their own resistance became kind of transformative and transcendent, in the sense that now the struggle was not only about using the political struggle to save culture or protect culture, which was the narrative all these years, but now it was about using the vast reserves of our culture and our language and our traditions, and wielding that as a weapon to advance our political rights, advance our civil rights. So this was a huge shift in narrative when Tibetans became to focus kind of on their own cultural capital, on their own strengths, on their own individual powers. Like one individual can do so much, and that was the shift that took place in the sense of transformative resistance. And I think that's what I mean when I, by calling it transformative resistance, in the sense that Tibetans are now challenging not only the material powers or the military powers of the Chinese government, they are basically challenging China's narrative on Tibet, China's discourse on Tibet. All of the colonizing discourse and narrative that China has tried to build over these last 50, 60 years, Tibetans are tearing them down and, basically declaring their own freedom and independence by creating a parallel orbit of freedom within a system of repression that is still very much alive.